Hello, class, and welcome back to Political Science. In this unit, we're going to be exploring Chapter 3, and that is our unit on federalism. Now, this is going to be a new topic for a lot of you. The term federalism is not one that you commonly hear day to day, but believe it or not, that's a really important word that shapes each and every one of your lives. Federalism is an extremely important idea when it comes to American government because essentially what federalism is all about is who gets to decide, who gets to make the decisions that impact your life. If you think back to our last unit on Chapter 2, we talked about one of the desires of the framers of the Constitution, and that was to separate the power in our system. So if you think about the way that our national government is structured, we have some powers for the president, some powers for Congress, and some powers for the courts. And the idea there is that if you take that power and you spread it all around, hopefully what happens is you end up preventing tyranny. Now, a lot of times that's where the conversation ends, but another really important factor of the way that power is distributed in our government is that the states get some of that power too. It really matters in our country which state that you live in. So if you live in California, you might have one type of experience. If you live in another state, your life might be slightly different. But we're all together within the same country. So in this chapter, what we're going to be exploring is how is the power organized between the states and the federal government? What responsibilities do they both have? What do they need to do? And what can they do? So we're going to be looking this week at the benefits of federalism. We're going to be looking at pros and cons. And we're also going to be seeing how American federalism has changed over time. And before we get started, I will say that when I started teaching this topic, I did find it a little bit dry at first. As you go through the chapter, in Chapter 3, you're going to see that the textbook can be a little bit technical at times, which feels a little bit less engaging. But I promise you that this information is actually really interesting if you look at it the right way. So one of the things that we'll also be doing this week is trying to take this kind of abstract idea and bringing it into our own lives so you can see how federalism impacts you. And so one of the first things that we're going to have to talk about is patterns of power. Okay, if we're talking about how power is distributed, well, what does that look like? And by the way, federalism is not the only type of government, so we're going to be looking at some examples as well. I have this question for you. Let's imagine somebody comes up to you on the street, they put a microphone in your face and they say, how many governments does the United States have? And you need to answer that question right now. Okay. Now, if you're like most Americans, your answer is going to be, well, that's easy. We've got one government. We know who the president of the United States is, and we know that we have a capital in Washington, D.C. We're one country. So we have one government, right? Well, not so fast, because actually we don't just have one government. Because think about it. We also have a governor. We have a mayor. We have all of these different people that are in the mix. And so maybe we have more than one government. In fact, it might surprise you to find out that we have a lot more than one government. As of 2022, when the U.S. Census Bureau kind of put out an update, at that time we had over 90,000 governments in the United States. Of course, we've got our national government in Washington, D.C. We've got 50 state governments plus the city of D.C. itself, which has its own government. But if you think about your life here, you've got the city that you live in, probably has a mayor and a city council. If you live in Los Angeles, like me, you've also got the Los Angeles Board of Supervisors. That's the county level. And you can go up from there. We have, the state. We have all of these different kind of institutions, including local towns. We've got special districts, like maybe a water district, making decisions about the water in our area. You've got school districts that are deciding on school policies and curriculum. Should we hire? Should we downsize? What should we do? All of these different parts of government all have real power. That's really interesting. Okay, so who gets to decide? Well, all 90,000 of these governments have actual power to make decisions to impact people's lives. And so you can see that it wasn't just about spreading the power between the president, Congress, and the courts, but we're also filtering that power down through different levels as well. Again, with the idea of having more autonomy at the local community level, but also hopefully in doing that you prevent tyranny as well. So it's always a good idea to define your terms, and we want to define what federalism means. That's one thing that we're going to do right now. So throughout this whole series of lectures, you're going to hear me refer to two different terms that sound very similar, but I promise you they are different. If you ever hear me say federal government, what I'm talking about there is the national government. You know who the president is, you know it's in Washington, D.C. It's that national government for all of us. But if I say federalism, I'm talking about something completely different. And federalism is a system of government. And what it does, the thing that makes it federalism, is it's dividing power between a national government on the one hand, and then you have your regional governments on the other. That's state and local government. Each one of those levels has the authority to make and enforce their own laws, and that is going to be outlined in a constitution. Trust me, I've got a lot more to say about federalism, so we're going to keep it there. Now, I always like a picture to kind of explain what we're talking about. And here you see a picture from 2018. At the time, there were many wildfires raging across the state of California. In fact, the 2018 wildfires at that time were the largest fire in California history. No longer, there have been bigger ones since, but it was a huge deal. We had almost 2 million acres burnt in the state. We had dozens of people who passed away and thousands of buildings that were destroyed. Many people lost their homes. And of course, that's a big deal. And so here you have, at the time, acting governor Gavin Newsom. And who is he meeting with? He's meeting with the president of the United States, Donald Trump. They're both there together. And usually these two are seen as having kind of that combative relationship with each other. But what are they doing? They're coming together, state and national, and they're trying to work on a problem that is impacting the lives of Americans. So we're going to see that this kind of relationship between state and federal government is very important with federalism as well. So I do have another question for you, which is this. Let's say that you were organizing a brand new government from scratch. How would you organize the power? Would you have maybe one person or a few people at the top making decisions for everyone? Or maybe you would want somebody in your own local community, maybe your local community making those decisions. There are compelling arguments on both sides of that. And this is something that every country has to contend with. And that's going to bring us to understanding 3 different types of the way that you would structure government. So we're going to see that federalism is not the only type of system out there. We also have unitary governments and confederal governments. Take a look at this image for a second, if you would. You're going to see that there's these 3 different systems, and they have some similarities. At the top, there's always a national government. And that makes sense. For us, we have the national government in Washington, D.C. But every country also has these local areas too. In the United States, we call them states. In Canada, they call them provinces. In Japan, they're called prefectures. Whatever they're called, they're these local units of government. The question is, who has the power? And so what the arrows are illustrating for us here is the flow of power in this system. If you look at unitary government, which we're going to explore in greater detail on the next slide, you see that the power is held within the national government and it flows down to the states. What does that mean? We'll get there in just a second. In a confederal system, it is the exact opposite. The state governments hold most of the power, and that flows up to the national government, giving the national government permission to do certain things. In a federal system like the one that we have, you can see that the direction of those arrows goes both ways, and that's because both levels of government have real decision-making, they have real power, and they influence each other. So why don't we get started then with unitary? If you were to go all around the world and really start looking at the different countries and how they set up their governments, you would see that the unitary style of government is by far the most common, the most popular. There are about 165 countries around the world that have a unitary model. And the most important thing to know about a unitary system is that the national government really has all the power. The national government is setting policy on all kinds of things. The use of police, the social welfare system, education curriculum, taxes, all of that kind of stuff gets set at the national government level, and then they expect the state governments to carry that out. The function of the state government is not to make decisions that impact your life, it's to really carry out those national policies. And so you tend to see very similar policies, very similar governance throughout the entire country. There are a lot of countries that are included as unitary, but some of the big ones that we might think about would be, say, the United Kingdom, France, Japan, Ghana. These are all going to be countries that have a unitary style of government. So let me give you an example of what one of these policies might look like in a unitary country. And for this example, we're going to go back to the year 2020, which, as you remember, was a pretty unusual year because it was the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And you had national governments around the world changing and adjusting their policies in response to the virus and the pandemic that was happening. And so in the country of France, you actually had a period of time for a few months where the national government banned bicycling. Okay. And so you had the national government setting a policy that says you're not allowed to ride your bike. You're not allowed to exercise more than 2 kilometers away from your home, which is a little over a mile. And that was put into effect throughout the entire country. So it didn't matter if you lived in a really dense part of Paris, or maybe you were in a little tiny town where there's not very many people. The idea there was that they were going to prevent biking so as to not, have people going far and potentially spreading the virus. Now, that's kind of interesting because that's one policy for the whole country. And as we get into our later lectures, we're going to see that in the United States, we had a very different system where state and local governments had a lot more control about what those local policies were going to be like. The big deal with the unitary system is also that we have this kind of uniformity across the entire country. That uniformity really means that you can know what to expect from your government, regardless of where you live. If you live in the United States and you move to a different state, you might have a different tax rate. There might be different regulations. There might be a lot of different policies that impact you. That's not really true as much in a unitary system. You could move from one part of the country to another and you know what to expect. So could be good, could be bad, depending on how you look at it. In a unitary system, the state governments receive their funding from the national government. So that power comes down, but so does the funding. That's very different from the United States. You can think about the way our system works, and the state of California is collecting taxes, and so is every other state, right? So we pay taxes on our income, there are property taxes, there's state sales taxes, and so the states in our system are much less reliant on that national government funding. In a unitary government, again, there's going to be that more uniformity across the system. Let's talk about one of the cons of a unitary system. And one of the cons would be that because these local governments can't try out new policies, you really lack that sort of policy experimentation. Sometimes somebody might have a crazy idea and they implement it as a policy. Hopefully it's not too crazy. You got to get enough people on board with it. But it's a new idea that's never been tried before. Sometimes it's going to be a success. Sometimes it's not. Now, in a unitary system, because everything is top down, you could potentially put the entire country at risk if you have a bad idea. And so we're going to explore that a little bit later in the lectures as well. All right, moving on to our next form of government, and that is going to be the confederal government. Hey, our last one, unitary, was the most popular in the entire world. Guess what? I cannot give you even one single example of a confederal system in the world today because there are none. There's really no true confederal system in the world today. It's the least popular out of the three. Why is that? Well, a great example of a confederal system, think back to our last unit where we talked about the Articles of Confederation. What did we say about the Articles of Confederation? If you had to define it in one word, that word would be weak. The idea within a confederation is that the states retain nearly all of the power, and the national government can only do what the states give it permission to do. And that means that the national government is very weak. Here's an example. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government could not require that the states pay their taxes. So they could ask, hey, states, would you mind kind of paying your taxes, send us the money? Guess what happened? A lot of the states didn't actually even send any money. So why do confederal systems why don't we have any examples of these today? Well, what happens to weak states? They usually end up either getting conquered by their neighbors or they're at risk of a revolution within their own country and getting replaced by a more powerful state. And so they don't tend to survive as well. But again, flip the concept of a unitary. Here at the confederal system, you have the states retaining nearly all of the power, and the national government only is allowed to do what the state governments give it permission to do. States can opt out of national policies. If they don't like the law, they don't have to follow it. Another example, of course, of a confederation, you will remember that during the Civil War, there was the Union, the Northern Army, fighting the Confederates, the Southern Army. Why were they called the Confederates? Well, because those breakaway states, they wanted to form a confederal type of government where, again, those states retained nearly all of the power. So that's confederal system now, which brings us to the moment we've all been waiting for. We're so excited. We're so pumped. This week we get to talk all about federal systems. All right. Maybe you're not as excited as I am about federalism, but that's okay. Federal government is the kind that we have in the United States. And although it's far less common than a unitary form of government, some of the biggest and most populous, most powerful countries in the world have this system of government. I'm talking United States, India, the country with over 1 billion people, one of the most populous countries on the planet. We've got other big countries like Brazil, Canada, Mexico. These are really big players in international politics. They all have federal governments. And what we're talking about in terms of the system of federalism is that we have, those two levels of government, and they're sharing powers. They each have distinct powers. Both levels can impact the lives of people that are in those places. So for instance, think about your life in California. We have a national government, and that national government has a national military. They protect the entire country. It doesn't matter where you live. We've got the U.S. Army, the Marines, the Navy, and the Air Force, and they're all going to have that responsibility of keeping the whole country safe. But then you've also got state governments with their own programs and their own right to make laws. So there's variation across different states. So they both have real power. They also both have their own governments and autonomy. So if you think about it, we have the President of the United States. Well, guess what? In California, we have a state governor. We have the U.S. Congress in Washington, D.C., but we also have our state legislature in Sacramento, and we have state and national courts. So within a federal system, you have these basically two different levels, each with their own autonomy that's typically outlined in national constitution. Some common features, some common characteristics of federalism is, again, you have those two different levels. You have a national constitution that's outlawing the powers of each, and it cannot be changed unless the state governments give permission. You're also seeing that from time to time, we do have conflict. A state might disagree with the national government, or you might have two states that are fighting with each other. Well, what do? In a federal system, you typically have national courts that help resolve those disputes. One last feature of federalism is that typically the states themselves are also represented in government. For us, that's the United States Senate. And you're going to remember from last unit is that what is the role of the Senate? It's to ensure that we have equal representation for each state. It's really there to represent the 50 states in the country. Doesn't matter if you're a giant state like California, we get 2 senators. If you go to a little teeny tiny state like Wyoming, population-wise anyway, they get 2 senators. Might not seem fair to some people living in California, but it's a really important part of maintaining that cohesion between states with very different populations, with very different preferences. And so that's going to be a feature of federalism as well. All right, we've covered some good ground in this video. I hope that you are interested in this topic. We're going to get more into the details of federalism in our next video, where we're going to explore what the U.S. Constitution has to say about this relationship and who gets to decide, the national government or the state government, on different topics. So I will see you there. Thanks so much.